In Dull Knife's Wake, Chapter 4, The Battle of Turkey Springs, September 13 and 14, 1878. At his court-martial, Captain Hemphill said he was puzzled as he led his company north from soldiers' graves at dusk on the evening of Friday the 13th. He wondered where Dull Knife and the northern Cheyenne could be. The truth would have frightened him, although most of Dull Knife's men were 30 miles away to the southeast. A significant handful of warriors stayed very near him, watching his every move from the hills to the northwest. By Friday, the warriors were eager to fight, their women and children safely hidden away inside the big basin. On the other hand, Rindlebrock was not in the least puzzled about the Cheyenne. He knew exactly the location of the Cheyenne warriors. Looking up, he could see they were all around him and his men. For Rindlebrock, the events began very early Friday morning, when he roused the battalion and their camp on the Cimarron River, a few miles below present-day Freedom, Oklahoma. At the mouth of Turkey Creek, he turned north, up the watershed, and the horsemen followed him along the well-traveled route to Kansas. Rindlebrock and his company were quite familiar with the area, having explored and surveyed the Turkey Creek area the year before. In fact, Rindlebrock had often passed through, his first visit 18 years earlier as a first sergeant in the old 1st Cavalry. As Rindlebrock progressed up the creek, the banks rose higher and became rather steep in places, towering over the soldiers by 100 feet. About 5 or 6 miles below the crest of the Cimarron's watershed, they came to an area that featured several prominent red hills. It was slow going, and Rindlebrock set a pace that matched his strength. Despite Misner's urging, Rindlebrock had been unable to keep pace with the Cheyenne. It took the cavalry about 20 hours more to cover the 100 miles or so from the last Cheyenne camp near Fort Reno to the entrance of Turkey Creek. 50 miles a day was slow for light cavalry, snail-like compared to Dull Knife's Cheyenne. In truth, Rindlebrock and many of his men were not up to such difficult duty. The Indian wars were over, as everyone knew. Now they faced the tedious reservation days, with most all Indians removed to their final homelands. Before, the men had made long patrols, expeditions out on the plains, but they always came back to the fort to rest. Now the 4th Cavalry seemed to be always in the field, always on the move, always hungry, dirty, groggy from lack of sleep. Rindlebrock's own weakened faculties certainly contributed to the upcoming disaster. In bright sunlight, Rindlebrock's eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he could recognize only vague shadows. He was so blind that his troopers knew to keep well back behind him whenever he drew his heavy Smith & Wesson Schofield Model .45 caliber pistol. Years before, he had been a good shot and could still hit any moving object within the boundaries of his dim vision. During the past months, however, he had accidentally killed his own horse during skirmishes with warriors escaping the reservation. Besides their unpredictable and often dangerous officer in charge, the hot, sunny weather had the usual debilitating effect on the young and rather inexperienced soldiers. If the troopers had had their way, they would have instantly stripped to their undershirts, shedding their heavy wool blouses. Many would have jumped at the chance to don straw hats in the heat, as other regiments reportedly wore in the field. Rindlebrock, always the Prussian disciplinarian, would not hear of such a breach of regulations, and absolutely forbade any modification of the heavy blue woolen uniform set. Dull Knife's warriors passed through the Turkey Creek area about 25 to 30 hours ahead of the cavalry. Exhausted as the Cheyenne must have been, the women and children continued on to Kansas after a short rest at the springs. Upon arriving at the upper reaches of the Salt Fork, a branch of the Arkansas River, Dull Knife, Big Crane, and a few other veteran pathfinders led the women and children up the riverbed. They noted, but did not attack, any ranch locations they came across. At about the present site of Buttermilk in southern Comanche County, they left the dry riverbed and headed southwest across the prairie to the Cimarron, a distance of about 5 miles. Reaching the great arc of the Cimarron, where it looped up into Clark County, they turned west and followed the river for 6 miles until they reached the mouth of Bear Creek. Then Dull Knife led the women and children north up that stream past soldiers' graves. Hemphill and Company 1 saw the tracks about 10 hours later, but did not follow them because their orders were to set up a blocking position at soldiers' graves. After ascending Bear Creek for a mile or two, Dull Knife came to the mouth of Kyger Creek and followed it all the way to a majestic hiding place called the Big Basin. Inside a narrow water pocket called St. Jacob's Well, the women and children were able to relax and refresh themselves around the deep, shaded sinkhole. As the sun appeared on the morning of Thursday, September 12, most of the men left the women and children and headed south across the broken country toward the cattle camps they had passed the night before. In Cheyenne autumn, Sandoz reported that Little Wolf instructed the Cheyenne to avoid all unnecessary conflict with the cattlemen and to kill as few as possible. This could well be true, but in light of what happened, such a directive seems impracticable, even naive. Such a thing seems incongruous given the independent nature of the Cheyenne warrior and the attitude of their primary foe, the Texas cattleman. It is well documented that the basic instinct of a Texas cattle herder was to shoot at Indians on sight when alone on the open prairie. Neither Dull Knife nor Little Wolf could dictate actions. They could merely advise. To the average Cheyenne warrior, the use of deadly force probably seemed not only expedient, but unavoidable. In fact, it seems that the warriors killed mercilessly, except when Little Wolf and Dull Knife were actually present. As we shall see, though, there are 3 documented cases where whites were captured, but their lives were spared. Most warriors followed George Bent's description that the Cheyenne did not torture their enemies, but killed them immediately. Along the border of Kansas, as the Cheyenne set out to collect as many horses, guns, ammunition, and other equipment as possible, they killed often, and with as little effort as was possible. In the early morning daylight in Clark County, Kansas, dozens of young and adult Cheyenne men emerged from their hiding places along Spring Creek and began to collect horses and cattle. The Quinlan brothers, whose pastures were directly in the Cheyenne's path, owned the first herds to be raided. During the 4 hours after dawn, the Cheyenne approached and killed 3 Quinlan cowboys. 2 of the men were easily slain, while the third, a Texan, was more wary and had to be chased down and killed. The first to die was probably Irish-born Thomas Murray, whose body was found just west of Spring Creek. Charles Colcord, one of the search party who found Murray on October 2nd, later wrote that he believed Murray died first. Scalped, Murray lay face down in the grass, which was customary to the Cheyenne. Next to fall was a young Swedish-born youth whom the cowboys called Con Red. His body was discovered lying near the mouth of Spring Creek, 1 or 2 miles south of Murray's body. 30-year-old Samuel LaForce, a veteran cattle herder from Texas and Indian Territory, was next to fall. His body was found about 4 miles north of Spring Creek in the middle of a flat, grassy meadow. Because he had run his horse so far from the Quinlan Range and was not along a stream bed where the cattlemen first concentrated their search, his body lay undiscovered until late October. After procuring Quinlan's cattle and horses, the main body of warriors continued down the stream bed to the Cimarron, then headed up Bluff Creek and its tributaries. The war party passed by the Day Driscoll camp on Day Creek without incident, possibly because the camp was hidden around a bend and was not visible from the river. At the mouth of Bluff Creek, some warriors turned up Bluff Creek, others headed up Sham Creek. The latter group spotted a single horseman near a large herd of longhorn cattle. Riding lazily along, Frank Dow looked up to find himself in the center of 4 Indians. He died without saying a word. Lieutenant Cornelius Gardner, who investigated, wrote that Dow's scalped body was found face down in a grassy meadow between Bluff and Sham Creeks. The warriors sent the dead man's horse and the cattle to the Big Basin, driven by young boys. A mile north of Dow, Cheyenne warriors found Warren Richardson and killed him without warning. Except for LaFours, all the men killed so far were from the east, or, in Red's case, from Sweden. Except for LaFours, they seem to have made no attempt to defend themselves. Most of them carried no weapons. The group of warriors in Sham Creek rode north, 8 or 9 warriors gathering horses as they went along. Coming up on the prairie, they spotted a cowboy. The rider was Hilton Anderson, a Texas cowboy working for Doc Day. By the time he noticed the horses, all but one of the warriors had slipped down and hid behind their horses' necks. Black Beaver, the single visible warrior, waved at the cowboy and turned toward him. Anderson thought at first that he had caught one Indian stealing horses. He pulled his pistol and shot at the Indian from some distance. Unluckily for Black Beaver, Anderson proved to be an excellent shot. The old warrior fell, fatally wounded, to the ground. Immediately, the rest of the Cheyenne rose up on their horses' backs and turned on the attacker. Anderson raced south toward the Cimarron with what he described as a dozen Cheyenne on his tail. After a chase of a few miles, Anderson was greatly relieved to spot a group of cowboys from the D-Cross Ranch who came to his aid. Immediately, the Cheyenne turned away. Anderson led the cattlemen back to Black Beaver's body, which lay between Bluff Creek and Sham Creek. The cattlemen carried the body to Doc Day's camp on Day Creek. Only a mile or 2 north of where Black Beaver was shot, and at about the same time, several men were eating breakfast at Dennis Sheedy's headquarters camp on Cavalry Creek. There were probably 5 men in the camp, including the cook. Parked nearby were 2 flatbed wagons. One, the chuck wagon, was parked with its rear to the campfire. Several horses were being held in a wood post oak corral nearby. To everyone's amazement, a single Cheyenne appeared in the camp circle and walked casually toward the cook. The cattle herders gawked at the sight of the Indian, who at first seemed only curious, posing no threat to anyone. Some of the old-timers scuttled out of his way, and at least one tried to stow his easily pilferable items like tobacco and ammunition. The veteran warrior boldly strolled between 2 cowboys sitting near the fire and looked inside the chuck wagon. Everybody jumped up in shock when the Cheyenne reached inside the box and pulled the cook's Sharps rifle out, butt end first. Ignoring the shouts for him to put the gun back, the Cheyenne calmly checked the weapon for ammunition, pulled back the hammer, and turned and aimed it at the nearest cowboy. The rifle belched fire, and an unfortunate cowhand named John Evans was blasted backward across the camp, landing on his back. He lay still. His shirt was blackened, torn, and bloody from the impact of the heavy bullet fired at point-blank range. Hats flew. 10 dishes full of food were strewn across the camp as the remaining cowboys and the cook crashed headlong into the thick brush along the stream. At the steep creek bank, the leading men jumped blindly off the creek bed while the cook dove into the thick brush. The cook was a bit slower than the others and was struck by a second shot, but the wound was not serious. The 3 other men, including Cyprian Bates, found themselves huddled in the bottom of the creek. The warrior made no effort to chase the cowboys or to finish off the cook. After several moments, Bates crawled up to the cook in the underbrush, and they quietly observed the camp. 3 more warriors had appeared. Together, the 4 men systematically ransacked the chuck wagon for more weapons and booty. After several moments of looting the wagon, they sat down and ate the rest of the cowboys' breakfast. Before they left, they dragged the wagons together and set them on fire. The men's bedrolls, saddles, and other equipment were cut apart and tossed into the fire. Later, Lieutenant Gardner would officially report that the Cheyenne took 13 horses, 20 pounds of bacon, the cook's Sharps carbine, 4 blankets, 4 suits of clothes, and 1 wagon sheet, and destroyed camp items worth a total of $1,635. From the bold, cool-headed nature of the attack and the number of men involved, this could well have been Black Coyote, assisted by his compatriot Sitting Man and his brothers-in-law, Heartless Wolf and Knife Sharpener. While Sheedy's cowboys were flying into the brush like a covey of quail, about 20 miles to the southeast, Little Wolf and a few veteran scouts were waiting patiently for Rindlebrock and the cavalry to appear. Camping on a high piece of terrain that is still called Lookout, at about 8 a.m., one of the Cheyennes spotted a two-mule wagon near their position. The wagon was moving slowly up Jug Mott Creek, headed, it turned out, toward the Cimarron River, Bend, and salt deposits to the southwest. An extra saddle horse was tied to the tailgate of the wagon. With the wagon were Reuben Bristow and Fred Clark, two young men from Virginia and Kentucky, working a summer adventure for Bristow's uncle, William Colcord. Neither Bristow nor Clark carried a gun, and neither one probably had ever seen an Indian. That morning their uncle got them up early and sent them over the hill to Salt Springs for a load of cattle salt. They were about 6 miles northwest of Turkey Springs when the Cheyenne emerged from two ravines nearby and attacked them. True to George Bent's assertion that the Cheyenne tried to kill instantly, in less than a moment both men were shot full of arrows. Stunned, probably dead instantly, both men fell backward off the seat into the empty wagon box. The mules bolted off across the rocky ground with the arrow-filled bodies bouncing around in the wagon. After a short run, the mules crashed down a short slope and slammed headlong into a grove of young willow saplings. The wagon shuddered to a halt in the saplings, its wheels lifted off the ground. More cowboys would die in the following days, but Bristow and Clark were probably the last ones to die on Thursday, September 12. After taking the two mules from Bristow and Clark's wagon, Little Wolf and his scouts returned to Lookout and camped, waiting for the cavalry to appear. One or two men were probably sent back along the trail. As evening approached, these scouts came in and reported the two cavalry companies from Fort Reno had camped about 2 hours southeast of Lookout in the bed of the Cimarron. Another scout came in from the Camp Supply Road and told of a third cavalry troop riding up toward Bear Creek in Kansas. Now that he knew where Rindlebrock was, Little Wolf moved west to the Red Hills. All night, the warriors who had spent the previous day rounding up cattle, horses, and guns came into Little Wolf's camp. By dawn the next morning, most of the veterans were there, except for Dull Knife and some older warriors who guarded the women and children. Just after sunrise on Saturday morning, a warrior on the high ground east of the Red Hills signaled Little Wolf that the Fort Reno cavalry was riding up Turkey Creek. Little Wolf and the Cheyenne moved to their vantage points above the stream. Down in the creek bed, riding ahead of the double line of troopers, Phil McCusker, Flat Braids, and a half-dozen other Cheyenne and Arapaho scouts spotted movement as they approached the high bluffs near Turkey Springs. Rindlebrock and the column were in a narrow defile beneath some very high, almost overhanging bluffs. Without warning, the cavalry scouts held up their hands in the universal signal gesture of halt. McCusker, a white scout on loan from Fort Sill, waved for Rindlebrock to come forward. Rindlebrock could only see dimly some forms ahead, but McCusker described the scene to him. Across a rolling meadow, directly ahead of the scouts, was a line of about 30 Cheyenne mounted on good horses. Flat Braids and other Cheyenne scouts rode forward halfway and stopped. Among the Cheyenne, the scouts recognized in the line were Wolf Name, Curly Hair, Big Head, Noisy Walker, Strong Left Hand, Black Coyote, Whetstone, Vanishing Heart Wolf, Old Crow, Wild Hog, Tangle Hair, Sitting Man, and Little Wolf. Little Wolf was in the center. When one of the Cheyenne police began yelling in his native tongue at Little Wolf's men, McCusker paused in his description of the scene to Rindlebrock. From near the center, a Cheyenne yelled something back. Years later, John Stands in Timber, Big Head's godson, said that his godfather told him that the Army scout, Flat Braids, told the Cheyenne that they must return. He pointed at Little Wolf and said, "We came after you. The superintendent has sent troops and police. He wants everyone to come back to the reservation. If you come back now, there will be no fighting. Remember the children and the women. Will you come?" Curly Hair, one of the Cheyennes sitting next to Little Wolf, shouted back to Flat Braids, "Go back and tell them we are going home. We don't want any fighting. If the army wants to fight us, they can. We are not going back." Flat Braids ignored Curly Hair's response and shouted to the Cheyenne to surrender. While the Cheyenne yelled at each other, John Chalk, an Arapaho scout, recognized 3 of his own horses among the Cheyenne in front of him. Becoming angry, he grabbed a pistol from a soldier and spurred his horse forward. At this juncture, Wolf Name, one of Little Wolf's warriors, raised his rifle and shot Flat Braids in the arm. As Wolf Name's shot rang out, Chalk charged wildly across the gap, separating the 2 sides straight into the warriors. What followed was a melee. All the warriors began firing, their ponies bucking in panic. Some fired at Chalk, but most aimed at the other scouts and soldiers. Rindlebrock, McCusker, and the Indian scouts retreated down the creek bed, diving for cover. Little Wolf was as surprised by the shooting as the soldiers. The horses of 3 of a group of 7 warriors bolted as Chalk's rush carried him through their ranks. At point-blank range, Chalk fired the pistol at Sitting Man. The force of the heavy bullet broke a bone in Sitting Man's upper leg. 2 Cheyenne on rearing horses maneuvered around Chalk, firing at the Arapaho at close range. Hit several times, Chalk dropped his Smith & Wesson and slumped over his horse, which turned and trotted back toward the soldiers. Mortally wounded, Chalk made it back to the creek under the steep banks. Hastily, Rindlebrock ordered the entire battalion to dismount. Every 4th man, about 23 soldiers in all, were immediately lost as fighting men, their duty being to gather the horses and keep them from harm. The horses filed back down the creek and up a narrow side gully where the men hoped the sides were steep enough to keep them out of the rifle fire. The remaining 60 cavalrymen crawled forward. Their single-shot Springfield rifles pointed toward the steep side of the creek bed to the west and the more gentle rise on the east. By now the soldiers were frantically digging fighting holes. Pulled from his horse and laid on the soft grass, the soldiers observed that Chalk had been hit 3 times, through both thighs and his groin. 1 bullet had penetrated his bowels. As the wounded Arapaho lay silently in the hot sun, Rindlebrock committed the cardinal sin for any officer in battle, even more inexplicable for such a veteran. By all reports, he panicked, exhibiting fear and confusion to his own troopers. It was as if he sensed his options all led to doom, and in his terror he resolved to do nothing. Here was a veteran of 100 battles and skirmishes, but suddenly he had no stomach to charge the Cheyenne and was helplessly trapped where he was. He could see the Cheyenne were prepared and dug in, their riflemen firing from hidden locations on the cliffs above. A few crawled through the brush on the more gently sloping eastern bank. Behind the captain, individual soldiers broke and ran here and there, trying to find cover on either side of the creek. Moments after the fighting began, several Cheyennes suddenly appeared near the soldiers who had crawled to the east bank. The warriors attacked individual troopers with knives and pistols, but ran away before anyone was killed. At the climax of the hand-to-hand fighting, 2 groups of mounted Cheyenne raced along the high ground, on both flanks firing down into the creek. Back in the rear, a few soldiers from Company H tried to retreat down the creek, but were driven back by volleys of rifle fire. Their retreat was cut off. As the battle settled in, a seemingly random rattle of rifle fire rained down from rifle pits dug into the bluff above. Things settled into a deadly routine. By noon, 3 horses had been hit. Their muffled screams and death throes would echo up the creek for several moments before a single shot rang out and their whinny stopped suddenly. The day, windless and dry, grew unbearably hot. The sun's rays reflected off the sides of the canyon onto the soldiers. After a few hours of rifle fire, the rate slackened. Rindelbrock recovered somewhat and ordered officers' call. Up the creek, lieutenants came crawling. Only Captain Gunther failed to appear. Rindelbrock ordered Lieutenant Wood to take a detail of skirmishers and charge on foot up the steep bank to the west to see if the Cheyenne would pull back as he attacked. At the same time, Lieutenant Wilder was ordered to do the same to the east. Giving them a few moments to get into position, Rindelbrock had the buglers sound the signal, and the two young officers dashed up the banks to higher ground, followed by ragged lines of sweating troopers. Wood headed up a break in the steep western cliff, and after 100 feet or so ran across a set of rifle pits dug in on the cliff top. From these pits, a few warriors leaped up, and some hand-to-hand fighting occurred. After a few moments of this skirmishing, with men attacking other men with rifle butts and pistols, several warriors appeared above the position, and Wood promptly ordered a withdrawal and retreated safely down the hill. One of Wood's men, Corporal Lynch of Company G, lagged behind with Wood to give the other soldiers a covering fire. Lynch, an Irish-born 7th Cavalry survivor of Little Bighorn, knew many of these Cheyenne personally from other battles. He backed down the hill, firing steadily. A bullet hit him, and he fell back down the slope, dying almost immediately. For Wood and the other soldiers, Lynch's body laying up on the slope became a visible reminder of their looming defeat. Near dusk, the three lieutenants begged permission to lead a mounted charge straight up the creek to the spring where they would try to fill all the canteens and then fight their way back. If they could get water in return, the men could hold out for another day. Without explanation, Rindelbrock denied the request. Hours passed slowly. Private Frank J. Stroud of Company H was struck in the head by a sniper's bullet and died instantly, falling forward into the sand. As the long day progressed, the suffering Rindelbrock refused to move, even though his lieutenants continually requested permission to lead charges against the Cheyenne. As darkness fell, Captain Gunther appeared, crawling out of a nest of thick bush where he had spent the day. His men must have turned away in disgust. That night, the moon and the stars were so bright in the clear air that a pale glow illuminated the scene and cast dark shadows down in the creek bed. Expert rifle fire kept the soldiers confined to the creek, although they could move about in the shadows with impunity. About 9 p.m., 7 enlisted soldiers decided to make a dash for water without orders. After about 20 yards, a heavy rifle bullet hit and felled Private George Leonard, wounding him seriously. The other 6 men retreated back to their holes, dragging Leonard with them. About midnight, Captain Gunther reappeared, walking among his men. A Cheyenne's rifle bullet zinged in, clipping his ear. In fright, the officer fled back into his plum thicket, his ear bleeding copiously. While their elderly captains misbehaved in the face of the enemy, as a court-martial would later brand Rindelbrock, the relatively inexperienced lieutenants took over and began to prove the worth of their generation. Wilder and McDonald were very young, less than 5 years out of West Point. Wood was older, a Civil War veteran who had spent nearly 10 years in the 4th Cavalry. While both their captains would eventually be court-martialed for their behavior here and elsewhere, Lieutenant Wood earned only praise, not only from his fellow soldiers, but even from the Texas cattlemen he met in Kansas. Wood established his career this day, earning high praise for bravery and competence. He would earn more praise at Sand Creek and in the battle at Punished Woman's Fork. The youthful Will Wilder was another young officer destined for glory, a Medal of Honor, and a General's Star. That night, however, even for the brave young men, the darkness and oncoming shadow of September 13 must have seemed foreboding indeed. All night the soldiers suffered from thirst. The wounded cried out. The soldiers should have known better, but it seems they had emptied their canteens before the fight began, not willing to drink the alkali and salt of the Cimarron. Most surface water in the bed of the Cimarron River consisted of stagnant pools that time of year or was undrinkably salty and full of minerals. They could have dug a shallow water hole in the riverbed, but Rindelbrock did not allow them to do so. Apparently, they all looked forward to drinking the pure water from Turkey Springs. When the dawn began to break on Sunday morning, a rotting smell of dead men and horses poisoned the thick air that drifted lazily up the creek bed. The sound of large horseflies and buzzing insects on the bodies gave an audible and disagreeable component to the prospect of dying. Soon, great turkey buzzards would smell the place and fly their long-winged circles overhead that marked the death of some creature. During the night, Cheyenne snipers had wounded 4 additional horses. 9 now lay in the creek bed, wounded or dying. 5 of the surviving troopers had lost their horses and would have to walk at least 50 miles to Camp Supply. Several other men were too incapacitated even to walk. The thirst and heat had diminished their strength, while the stress of being under fire for more than 30 hours caused mental breakdowns. Leonard, the wounded private, lay quietly unconscious, a bloody bandage over the bullet hole. By now there was absolutely no drinking water in the camp. As the bright sun flashed down the hill, the coolness of a stiff morning breeze stirred up the creek from the river. It felt deliciously refreshing on parched faces. Suddenly a crackling sound was heard from down the creek. Men guarding the lower end of the position shouted, "Fire!" Horses thrashed and whinnied as smoke poured into their hiding place. Soon roaring flames could be seen shooting up the creek bed toward the soldiers. The fire exploded in the dry brush. Some bursts of fire leaped across the creek banks and rolled upward toward the trapped men. The whole creek bed below the cavalry was soon engulfed in a dense white smoke that blew over their heads, choking them. Obviously, the Cheyenne counted on an early morning breeze to carry the fire among the soldiers. Warriors along the high bank came out, waiting for panicked soldiers to run blindly up the banks to escape. For a terrible moment, the strong south wind pushed the flames directly toward the soldiers. Salvation waited until the last moment. A weak cheer erupted when the wind gusted and changed direction and blew the fire up over the ridge to the east. The fire and close call had an unexpected effect. The lethargic soldiers shook off their thirst and pain and joined the lieutenants, Wood and Wilder, in a new charge. All jumped up yelling and raced up the creek bed. About 24 soldiers attacked the Cheyennes' positions. The rifle fire that rained down seemed half-hearted, not as accurate as before. The soldiers, firing their rifles and pistols at hidden marksmen, gained some ground at first. At the last moment, however, several Cheyenne raised up from their hidden rifle pits and drove the men back. Privates George Burroughs and John Mitchell, both of Company G, were struck and seriously wounded in the attack. Again, the attack had failed, and the lieutenants reluctantly ordered the men back toward their old positions. Soon the Cheyenne proved to be as dangerous and their shooting as accurate as the day before. Under the stress of a second day of this ordeal, Rindelbrock continued to exhibit mental confusion, rolling his eyes and cursing those near him. He was caught in a dilemma. If he kept the soldiers where they were, some of the weaker men might become crazy from thirst and die while water was available only yards up ahead. However, if he charged the Indians with the whole battalion, a number of them would probably be killed. In fact, the Cheyennes seemed eager for exactly just such a move. Rindelbrock called for the men to bring up the horses and ordered the men to mount in preparation for a charge. However, as soon as the Cheyenne began firing, he dismounted them again. Twice the men mounted, and twice they were ordered to dismount. Finally, Rindelbrock came to his senses. He ordered the lieutenants to rush the Cheyenne on horseback, as they had been long demanding. Wood's earlier assault had revealed some of the Cheyenne hiding places, and the troopers on foot directed fire at their adversaries. As the dismounted troopers fired away, the 3 lieutenants mounted their horses and led a charge with 20 men straight up the creek bed. Around the first bend, they came upon a group of Cheyenne gathered around Turkey Springs. Wood veered left and raced his horse directly at them, followed by most of the cavalrymen. The soldiers below saw several Cheyenne forced out of their rifle pits by his attack. Near the military crest of the high hill on the west, the warriors ran back to waiting horses, firing back at the advancing troops. During the charge up the hill, Francis E. Burton, Company H blacksmith, was shot dead and fell from his horse. By the time Wood and Wilder wheeled to a stop on top of the ridge above Turkey Creek, all they could see of the Cheyenne was a group of warriors riding near a strangely shaped pair of red hills about a mile off to the west. The siege was broken. Moments later, Rindlebrock rode up to the lieutenants and paused at the top of the hill with his senior sergeants. On a hill to the far western side of the valley, near the Red Hills, the soldiers saw a dozen Cheyennes sitting brazenly on their ponies, looking back. Rindlebrock ordered the men to charge the Indians. A ragged line of cavalry raced forward, some horses barely able to trot. Across the way, the warriors watched the cavalry come, then split up and retreated into a series of broken ravines which led up the watershed. Exhausted, the troopers halted their horses after less than a mile and turned back, too exhausted to continue. Soon the men gathered at Turkey Springs. Blessedly, the Cheyenne had not contaminated the precious liquid. The formerly lethargic men and dazed horses quickly revived. As soon as they were refreshed, the lieutenants organized a litter party to carry the wounded to the water. No one said a word when Captain Gunther joined the others at the waterhole. The fighting strength of the two companies had been severely depleted. For the rest of the day, the farriers and blacksmiths were kept busy ministering to wounded and worn-out horses. Other working parties collected the dead and buried them in graves, probably below the springs up on the ridge. Cheyenne-style travois were constructed of long poles, and 8 horses were selected to drag the wounded to Camp Supply. Chalk, Privates George Leonard, George Burroughs, John Mitchell, Conaline Hott, William Modinger, Martin O'Brien, and Augustus McClintock were too severely wounded to ride. According to the medical reports from Camp Supply, a dozen other men, mostly recruits, were in a state of shock, speechless from the ordeal. Of the 87 healthy men who rode into Turkey Creek on Friday morning, by Saturday afternoon at least 20 had been killed, wounded, or otherwise knocked out of action. 11 horses had been killed or had to be shot. Exhausted, the battalion rested all night at Turkey Springs. The graves of the dead were surveyed for future recovery, then all signs of them were carefully obliterated. Hout and Modinger went mad from their pain and had to be tied on their travois. 4 men of Company H, Sergeant Charles Kelly, Private Harold B. Long, Farrier Benjamin Adams, and Private Algernon Newton, plus Corporal Thomas Castillo of Company G, were told that they had to walk to Camp Supply since their horses were either dead or being used for a travois. Rindlebrock dispatched Harry Coons, a Shawnee scout, toward Camp Supply with a request that the post commander send a doctor and an ambulance up the military road and meet them as quickly as possible. As it grew dark on Sunday evening, the men of Companies G and H formed up and began to climb out of Turkey Springs, heading directly west toward the Cimarron and Camp Supply. By midnight, they had crossed over Lookout and filed down into the Cimarron Valley. Ahead of them were more than 15 hours of painful travel. The next morning, at about 8 o'clock, Coons reached Camp Supply, having moved cautiously all night. Going directly to the commander's office, the scout told Major Hambright his story. Hambright ordered an ambulance loaded and sent the post medical orderlies out to meet the column on the trail. About noon, Rindlebrock saw an ambulance coming over a hill ahead of him. By then the battalion was about 15 miles north of Camp Supply. Just before 4 o'clock Monday afternoon, Rindlebrock, his uniform soiled and stained, led his battered battalion onto the parade ground of Camp Supply. After reporting to Hambright, he sat down and wrote out his report. As part of the historical record, Rindlebrock's pithy and obviously self-gratifying report adds little to the history of the Dull Knife Chase. Transparently, he attempted to put the best face on his defeat and speckled the report with half-truths and exaggerations. No one would be fooled by the report, especially Hambright, who had known Rindlebrock for 20 years. Although the men at Camp Supply were undoubtedly sympathetic to the ordeal the men had suffered, there could be no doubt that the senior officer had lost his nerve and was routed by the Cheyenne. Hambright took notes, carefully recording the location of the 3 dead troopers. He made arrangements to care for the 7 wounded and the 10 disabled men in the post infirmary. 7 troopers who had been unhorsed were transferred to the Camp Supply garrison. Early the next morning, Hambright ordered Lieutenant Wood to take 43 fit men from the 2 companies and continue the pursuit of Dull Knife. Chastened, his command split apart. Rindelbrock and Gunther watched their companies head north, then retired to quarters at Camp Supply. The first battle of the Dull Knife chase was over, and the Cheyenne had won. No one doubted, however, that more deadly fighting was imminent. End of chapter 4.